Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. Before we kick off today's episode, YouTube announced earlier today it will begin removing videos critical of the 2020 election starting today. So we'll see what happens to this channel. Some updates: 8 other states joined Texas in their election lawsuit at the Supreme Court. For this episode, let's delve into an official government report, also known as a white paper, exploring the historical, constitutional, and legal meanings of the Electoral College deadline and what that means for the 2020 election. It's by the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society, composed of conservative lawyers. Yesterday, we touched upon what would happen on January 20th if no president is sworn in. Who would the military recognize as commander-in-chief in that scenario? And some other possible outcomes that could play out. Check out that video for more on historical context and what the Constitution says. And now, yesterday, December 8th, was Safe Harbor Day, or when all states are required to resolve election disputes. That hasn't happened, so what happens now? According to the paper from the Amistad Project, quote, "These dates are arbitrary, being based on obsolete and outdated concerns. In the event that federal law presents an obstacle to faithfully adhering to constitutional requirements, it is necessary to disregard the statute in favor of the plain meaning of the Constitution." Its executive summary reads, "The only Electoral College deadline specifically required by the Constitution is noon on January 20th, at which point President Trump's first term officially ends. All other deadlines, the Safe Harbor deadline of December 8th, the Electoral College voting on December 14th, and even the congressional vote count on January 6th, are dates set by federal law." The paper points out that the dates set by federal law are based on the assumption that states have laws in place awarding presidential electors according to the popular vote. But because the laws governing the conduct of elections were flagrantly violated in numerous states during the 2020 presidential election, there can be no determination of presidential electors pursuant to state law. As such, the Constitution makes clear that the responsibility rests with state legislatures to appoint electors. This should be done as fast as possible. But the only deadline state lawmakers have an obligation to meet is the one deadline set forth in the Constitution, noon on January 20th, 2021. As we saw yesterday in the case from 1876, a winner wasn't declared until 2 days before inauguration. This paper also analyzes the historical reasons for the dates in elections. For example, in 1848, the election day was placed uniformly on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That date was picked, quote, based on obsolete religious and agricultural concerns. In the 1800s, most citizens worked as farmers and lived far from polling places. Since it often took people at least a day to travel to a polling place, lawmakers needed a 2-day window for Election Day. Weekends were out of bounds because Sunday was for church and Wednesday was market day for farmers. The paper also indicates that the deadlines for the seating of electors and their voting, however, is not necessary for the effective transition of power. These dates are largely not relevant to a time when electors do not have to ride horses to Washington, D.C. to vote. It goes on to say, as has been demonstrated in this brief, there is significant flexibility and precedent in U.S. law for changing the date that electors are appointed, changing the date electors convene to vote, and changing the date electors have their vote certified by Congress. Changing the date would not prevent the Biden team from carrying out transition work in the event the transfer of power does occur, because the federal agencies, including the General Services Administration, have started the transition protocols, and Joe Biden has been appointing people to his cabinet. According to the paper, delaying those dates are reasonable because of the unprecedented thin margins between Trump and Biden in several states and the growing evidence of serious amounts of systemic electoral fraud. Adding, quote, "For the sake of the country, Joe Biden and his supporters should welcome a fair and impartial investigation, especially because they are so confident they will prevail. Otherwise, a dark cloud will hang over the Biden administration if it becomes clear his election was illegitimate, and the sociopolitical fragmentation that is occurring in the United States will only worsen." This is significant as it provides a legal basis for the legal fights across the country to continue. Many people have been asking, so many judges have been unwilling to take the legal cases, either to avoid the huge potential responsibility or to maintain their own political interests and so on. In addition, it is still a question whether the Supreme Court would accept the cases. Therefore, it might not be enough to just take the legal path to make sure that we have a fair, equitable, reasonable, and transparent outcome. So in this case, what other options does President Trump have? Trump signed an executive order on imposing certain sanctions in the event of foreign interference in a United States election back in 2018. According to the executive order, within 45 days after the election, the Director of National Intelligence should conduct an assessment to determine if any foreign government or any person acting on behalf of a foreign government has purposefully interfered in that election. If so, the State Department and Treasury Department need to decide on appropriate sanctions on foreign actors. Coincidentally, on December 6th, John Ratcliffe, the Director of National Intelligence, spoke on Fox News about the roles of the Chinese Communist Party and the coronavirus pandemic on the 2020 election. He said, quote, "The Chinese Communist Party, when they knew about its transmissibility, allowed it to go from China to the rest of the world. They intentionally and deliberately downplayed it in their country, pressured the World Health Organization, and allowed it to spread to the rest of the world. And that didn't just have the effect of wrecking the global economy. It didn't just have the effect of killing millions of people, including hundreds of thousands of Americans. It also had grave political consequences. Here in the United States, the pandemic influenced a lot about how people voted, but also how they had to vote. As a result of the pandemic, we saw state legislatures as little as 90 days before the election adopting new voting procedures. Essentially, we had universal mail-in balloting across this country in a way we hadn't seen before. As mentioned previously from the Amistad Project hearing, the pandemic opened the door to widespread fraud. For example, the pandemic was used as an excuse to bar poll observers and challengers from entering the counting centers or from standing close enough to observe effectively. From this point of view, it can be said that foreign factors are interfering in the current U.S. election already, and because of that, the conditions would have been met for the 2018 executive order to impose sanctions. But the sanctions are far from effective to solve the issues related to the election fraud, because those were only economic sanctions. If the fraud was a systematic case and many Americans' confidence in the government and the election has been damaged, sanctioning some foreign people or institutions would not help. Probably a new presidential executive order is needed to solve the issues demonstrated in this election. Let's look back to President Trump's speech on December 2nd. He began his speech by saying, "This may be the most important speech I've ever made." This is a very strong statement.
As president, I have no higher duty than to defend the laws and the Constitution of the United States. That is why I am determined to protect our election system, which is now under coordinated assault and siege.
He also said if we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taking place in our 2020 election, we don't have a country anymore. So if what President Trump has envisioned is beyond economic sanctions, what kind of measures is he going to take? On December 6th, President Trump commented interesting on the tweets of Scott Adams and Mike Caudry. In his tweet, Mike Caudry gave advice to the president saying, "Mr. President, we are asking you to declare Dominion and Smartmatic a national security threat by executive order. Bar U.S. states and U.S. persons from doing business with them." Then Scott Adams replied, "This is a no-brainer. Obviously, we have to do this under the national security umbrella." From this, Trump seems interested in their suggestions. Trump said during his speech in Georgia on December 5th,
And yesterday, I don't know if you saw it, the court just ruled that the money I took was taken illegally, so at least we have a legal wall. They said it was fine because I called it national security. So we took it out of the middle. They didn't figure that one out. Now they do.
In other words, the court approved that military funding can be used in domestic matters that affect national security. It's a concept that President Trump specifically mentioned in the rally, as well as the concept of national security. Trump also recently targeted social media companies that have been censoring free speech and suppressing conservative views. He demanded that Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act be repealed. He wrote on Twitter, Section 230, which is a liability shielding gift from the U.S. to big tech, the only companies in America that have it, corporate welfare, is a serious threat to our national security, election integrity. Our country can never be safe and secure if we allow it to stand. Therefore, if the very dangerous, unfair Section 230 is not completely terminated as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, I will be forced to unequivocally veto the bill when sent to the very beautiful Resolute desk. Again, President Trump associated the military with national security. Apparently, this is the direction he is thinking of. But exactly how will it be done, we don't know yet. And starting December 9th, we have YouTube also cracking down on election coverage. Since November 3rd, or Election Day, various people have been giving suggestions to President Trump. A November 6th article in the Washington Times delves into former House Speaker Newt Gingrich's thoughts about the election. Newt Gingrich says President Trump and all Americans face an existential crisis on par with the nation's darkest days, seen by George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. This is not about Donald Trump, he said. This is about the American people. Do the American people have the right in an honest election, with honest, legitimate ballots to pick their leader, or are we just sheep dominated by the high-tech businesses, the news media, and the various political machines? And are we supposed to surrender? He writes, so I think this is a crisis in the American system comparable to Washington on Christmas Eve, or comparable to Lincoln at Gettysburg. This is a genuine, deep crisis of our survival. He continues, my hope is President Trump will lead the millions of Americans who understand exactly what is going on. The Philadelphia machine is corrupt. The Atlanta machine is corrupt. The machine in Detroit is corrupt, and they are trying to steal the presidency, and we should not allow them to do that. According to Gingrich, the current situation, like what Trump mentioned in his speech, that is a question of survival of America. This question of survival could give Trump a legal basis for his future measures to deal with the situation. On December 1st, a full-page ad was published in the Washington Times newspaper demanding that President Trump invoke limited martial law in order to allow the U.S. military to oversee a new free and fair federal election if legislators, courts, and the Congress do not follow the Constitution. The ad's title is Exercising Extraordinary Authority in Defense of Our Vote May Be Required because Martial Law is Better Than Civil War. It compares the extraordinary executive actions implemented by President Abraham Lincoln in his efforts to save the Union during the Civil War and the literal civil war that is dividing our nation today without full confidence that our courts or Congress will indeed follow the 12th Amendment of the Constitution and defend our electoral process. The ad calls upon President Trump, like Lincoln, to exercise the extraordinary powers of his office and declare limited martial law to temporarily suspend the Constitution and civilian control of these federal elections in order to have the military implement a national revote that reflects the true will of the people. Federal candidates only, paper ballots, no computers, hand counted with both parties watching every vote. Only registered voters. Photo ID to prove residence, conducted safely with everyone wearing masks and 6 feet apart. The ad also talked about some decisive yet controversial actions President Lincoln took. The ad continues, while some debate these measures still today, no one disagrees that Lincoln and his use of presidential power were responsible for saving the republic. While history and even former President Obama has judged Lincoln as perhaps our greatest president, few would have agreed at the time he took those actions. Then, as now, a president with courage and determination was needed to preserve the Union. Today, the current threat to our United States by the international and domestic socialist communist left is much more serious than anything Lincoln or our nation has faced in its history, including the Civil War. In future programs, we can talk more about President Lincoln and his actions and discuss the relevance of that history to the current situation. But let me know what you think below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.